Spring 1968, Streeter Junction, Illinois. The men at the grain elevator watched Merle Gustafson load soybean seed into his truck and decided collectively that he'd finally cracked. Not corn seed. Soybean seed, enough for 160 acres. He's putting 40% of his ground in beans, someone muttered, the way you'd announce a terminal diagnosis. Another farmer shook his head. We're corn country. Always have been. Merle heard every word. He always did. But he didn't turn around, didn't defend himself, didn't explain, just kept checking bags against his order slip. Wayne, Hawkeye, Amsoy 71, like this was the most normal thing in the world. Here's what you need to understand. What Merle was doing wasn't just unconventional, it was financial suicide by 1968 standards. This was Livingston County, Illinois, where corn wasn't just a crop. It was identity, infrastructure, inherited wisdom. The elevator was built for corn. The equipment dealers stocked corn planters and corn heads. The local knowledge, passed down from fathers who'd survived the Depression, said corn was king and everything else was a fool's bet. Soybeans were what you planted on marginal ground, leftover acres, the spots where corn wouldn't thrive anyway. A rotation afterthought, a supplement crop. But Merle had been reading different reports. While his neighbors relied on coffee shop wisdom and generational tradition, Merle was studying University of Illinois extension bulletins from Urbana. The numbers told a story nobody wanted to hear. Soybean yields were climbing, from 18 bushels per acre in the 1950s to 25, sometimes 30 bushels by the mid-60s. New varieties were rolling out of agricultural experiment stations every year, each one bred for higher protein content, better disease resistance, adaptation to central Illinois soils. Prices were holding steady between $2, $40 and $2. 60 per bushel through most of 67 and into 68. That was better margin than corn when you did the actual math. Lower input costs, no nitrogen requirements, simpler weed control if you planned it right. And here's the kicker. Corn planted after soybeans yielded 8 to 12% better than continuous corn. The soil science was clear, but reading research in your kitchen and risking a third of your family's income are entirely different acts of courage. Merle farmed 400 acres 3 miles south of Streeter Junction. Good black dirt, drummer silt to clay loam, the kind of soil that rewards you if you treat it right and punishes you if you don't. The property had a white 2-story farmhouse that needed paint, a machine shed that always needed paint, and a hip roof barn his grandfather built in 1911. His wife Dorothy kept chickens and a garden, worked part-time at the school cafeteria. 3 kids, 2 in high school, 1 in junior high. A manageable mortgage as long as nothing went catastrophically wrong. Nothing had gone wrong. That was actually the problem. Merle was 42 years old, and he'd been running the same rotation his father taught him. Corn, oats, alfalfa seeding, then 3 years of hay. It worked. It paid bills. It kept the soil decent. But Merle had started noticing things that troubled him. The corn yields weren't climbing the way they should. He was applying more nitrogen every year, switching from anhydrous ammonia to a side dress program, and the response was flattening out. Soil tests showed adequate nutrient levels, but something fundamental wasn't adding up. Meanwhile, the 20 acres of soybeans he'd planted in 66 and 67 as an experiment had performed better than expected. The ground looked different after beans. Darker, more friable when he worked it the following spring. The soil structure had improved in ways nitrogen alone couldn't explain. So in February 1968, sitting at his kitchen table with a pencil and a Farm Journal article titled "The Coming Soybean Expansion," Merle made a decision that would define him. He was going to plant 160 acres of beans. That meant pulling 120 acres out of corn, 40% of his tillable ground, and betting on a crop most of his neighbors still considered experimental novelty. Dorothy looked at the numbers when he showed her. She didn't flinch, didn't lecture, didn't panic. Just nodded and said, "You've thought this through." "I have," Merle said, "then we'll make it work." That was Dorothy. No drama, no hand-wringing. If Merle said he'd done the math, that was enough. But the neighbors were going to be a different story entirely. The first person Merle told was Vernon Hykin, who farmed 600 acres just west of Merle's place. They'd known each other since grade school, helped with each other's harvests, borrowed equipment back and forth. When Merle mentioned the soybean plan over coffee at the Streeter Junction Cafe in March, Vernon set down his cup and stared. 160 acres, Vernon repeated, like he'd misheard. You serious? Dead serious? That's a hell of a gamble, Merle. Vernon's voice had an edge now. I don't think it is, Merle said calmly. The data supports it. Rotation benefits, lower input costs, stable market. Vernon leaned back, and here's where you see the clash of worldviews. Market's stable until it isn't, and beans don't have the yield potential corn does. You're giving up 120, 130 bushels of corn to plant a crop that might give you 25 bushels of beans. The math doesn't work. It does if you account for nitrogen savings and the yield bump on next year's corn, Merle replied. Vernon shook his head slowly. You've been reading too many university bulletins. Those guys don't farm, they sit in offices and publish papers. Real farming is different. That conversation set the tone for everything that followed. Think about what Vernon was really saying. I don't trust research because it doesn't come from lived experience. It's the eternal conflict between data and intuition, between systematic study and generational wisdom. Vernon wasn't stupid. He was protecting what had worked, defending a known quantity against an unknown risk. But here's what separates people who adapt from people who get left behind: the willingness to update your priors when the evidence changes. By April, when Merle started fieldwork, word had spread like gossip in a small town. At the implement dealer in Pontiac, where Merle went to look at a used soybean platform for his International Harvester 403 combine, the parts manager made a joke. Heard you're going into the bean business, Gustafson. You opening a tofu factory next? At the grain elevator, the manager pulled Merle aside with genuine concern. I hope you know what you're doing. We don't have a lot of bean storage here. You're going to be hauling to Chenoa or all the way to Fairbury. Even at church, Merle and Dorothy went to the Lutheran church in town every Sunday. People had opinions. Emil Thorson, a retired farmer and church deacon, cornered Merle after service. I farmed 40 years and never planted more than 20 acres of beans at a time, Emil said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. You know why? Because beans are a supplement crop, not a replacement. You're taking a risk you don't need to take. Merle listened, nodded, thanked people for their concern, but he didn't change his mind. This is where character reveals itself, not in the big moments, but in the quiet determination to stay the course when everyone you respect is questioning your judgment. Planting started the last week of April. Merle had sold his old corn planter and bought a used John Deere 4-row bean planter from a farmer down in McLean County who'd decided beans weren't for him. Merle calibrated it 3 times in his yard to ensure the population was exactly right. He was aiming for 180,000 plants per acre, tight enough for good ground cover, but not so tight the plants would compete for resources. The first field he planted was the 80-acre piece on the east side of the property, the ground that had been in corn the year before. He worked methodically, checking depth, checking spacing, stopping every few passes to walk behind the planter and dig up seed to verify placement. Vernon Hykin drove by that afternoon. Slowed down, kept driving, didn't wave. By mid-May, all 160 acres were in. The beans emerged evenly, first the crook of the hypercotyl breaking through, then the cotyledons spreading, then the first trifoliate leaves. Merle walked the fields every few days, checking stands, looking for disease, monitoring weed pressure. The fields looked clean, healthy. Different from corn, sure. Lighter green, lower canopy, but healthy. And here's something nobody talks about, the psychological toll of being the only one. Every morning, when Merle drove to town for supplies, he passed fields of corn. Solid corn, traditional corn, safe corn. And he had to trust that he was right and everyone else was wrong, or at least not wrong enough to matter. The growing season was good, but not spectacular. Adequate rainfall, no major disease pressure, temperatures within normal ranges. By July, the bean fields were canopying, closing the rows, shading out late weeds, beginning the long process of pod fill. Merle had done his homework on fertility. Soybeans fixed their own nitrogen through rhizobia bacteria in root nodules. But they still need phosphorus, potassium, sulfur. He'd soil tested every field, applied what was needed, trusted the science. Harvest came in late September. Merle had his soybean platform installed on the combine. Had adjusted the cylinder speed, set the fan just right. The first field he cut was the same 80-acre piece he'd planted first. Moisture was running around 13%. Perfect. The beans were flowing into the hopper clean, minimal splits, good test weight. When he dumped the first load at the scale in Chenoa, he wasn't hauling to Streator Junction, where everyone would be watching and calculating. The yield monitor showed 27 bushels per acre. At $2.50 a bushel, that was $67.50 gross per acre. After input costs of about $22 per acre, he cleared roughly $45 profit. Not spectacular, but solid. Respectable. More importantly, proven. But here's what nobody expected. The 1968 harvest was just the opening act. In the spring of 1969, Merle planted corn on the ground that had been in beans the previous year. Standard practice, good rotation, but when he harvested that corn in October, something remarkable happened. The yields hit 135 bushels per acre. The county average was 118. He'd gained 17 bushels just from the rotation effect, exactly what the university research had predicted. That 17-bushel bump at $1.10 per bushel added nearly $19 per acre of extra profit. When you combined that with the bean profit from the year before, the whole system started to pencil out in ways continuous corn never could. Merle didn't advertise these results, didn't throw a party or give speeches. But farmers talk, numbers leak. By 1970, 3 other farmers in the township had planted significant soybean acreage. Not 160 acres like Merle, nobody was ready to go that far, but 40, 50, 60 acres. Testing the waters. Vernon Hyken wasn't one of them. Not yet. Then 1973 happened. That was the year everything changed, not just for Merle, but for the entire agricultural economy of the Midwest. The Soviet Union, facing domestic crop failures, entered the world grain market as a massive buyer. Soybean prices, which had been stable around $2.50 to $3 per bushel, exploded to $6, then $8, then briefly touched $12 in some markets. It was unprecedented. Farmers who'd planted beans that spring watched their gross revenue triple, quadruple in some cases. The economics of Midwest agriculture shifted overnight. And Merle Gustafson, who'd been planting 160 acres of beans since 1968, was perfectly positioned. The 1973 growing season was exceptional. Warm, wet spring, timely rains through July, a long, mild fall that let beans mature slowly and fill completely. Merle's yields hit 38 bushels per acre. At $4 per bushel, he'd forward contracted some of his crop early, missing the absolute peak but locking in profit. That was $152 a gross per acre. After costs, he cleared $90 profit per acre on his bean ground. Multiply that by 160 acres. That's $14,400 in profit from beans alone in a single year. In 1973 dollars. For a farmer who'd been called crazy 5 years earlier. The corn did well too. Following beans, his corn yields hit 155 bushels per acre, 10 bushels above county average. The rotation effect was holding year after year, exactly as the research predicted. At harvest, the elevator in Streator Junction was overwhelmed. Trucks lined up for half a mile. Merle hauled most of his crop to Chenoa and Fairbury, where lines were shorter, but even there the volume was staggering. One afternoon, waiting in line at the Chenoa elevator, Merle struck up a conversation with a farmer from the next township over. Older guy, maybe 60, farming his whole life. "You're Gustafson, aren't you?" the man said. "That's right. I heard about you. Started planting beans back when everyone thought it was crazy." Merle shrugged. "I wouldn't say crazy, just different." "Well, it paid off," the man said. "You must feel pretty good right now." Merle considered that. Did he feel good? He felt satisfied. Not smug, not vindicated in any loud or showy way, just satisfied that the work had paid off, that the data had been right, that trusting the research and doing the math and sticking to the plan had worked. "It feels good to be farming right," Merle said. "That's all." Vernon Hyken planted 200 acres of beans in 1974. Didn't say much about it, didn't apologize, just did it. The following winter, at a Farm Bureau meeting, Vernon found Merle by the coffee pot. They hadn't talked much in years. Not hostile, just distant. The way neighbors get when decisions create distance. "I should have listened to you in '68, Vernon said quietly. "Would have saved myself 5 years. Merle poured his coffee, considered his response. Here's where you measure a man's character. He could have gloated, could have reminded Vernon of every dismissive comment, every piece of unsolicited advice, every implication that Merle was gambling recklessly. Instead, he said, "You're doing it now. That's what matters." Vernon nodded, something like relief crossing his face. "I appreciate that, for helping guys like me when we finally came around. You could have rubbed it in." "No point in that," Merle said. By the mid-1970s, soybeans were everywhere in Livingston County. The acreage had tripled, the elevator had expanded twice, implement dealers were selling more bean equipment than corn equipment. The old guys who'd said beans would never work, that corn was king forever. Most of them had retired or sold out. The next generation was farming differently, armed with data, willing to adapt. Merle kept doing what he'd always done. Rotation, corn and beans, steady and predictable. He didn't expand his acreage, didn't buy more land, didn't leverage himself into debt chasing the market. He farmed 400 acres, same as in 1968, and he farmed them well. One Sunday after church in fall 1975, Emil Thorson, the old deacon who'd warned Merle about beans back in '68, pulled him aside. Emil was in his 80s by then, shrunken and slow-moving, but his mind was still sharp. "You remember what I told you?" Emil asked. "About beans being a supplement crop." "I remember," Merle said. "I was wrong," Emil said. "I didn't think I'd live long enough to say it, but I was wrong. You saw something I didn't." Merle smiled. "You weren't wrong, Emil. Beans were a supplement crop back then. But things change. The research changes. The markets change. You have to change with them." "Still," Emil said, "it took nerve to do what you did." "Or stubbornness," Merle said, and Emil laughed. A dry, crackling sound, maybe a little of both. Now here's what this story is really about, because it's not about soybeans, it's about the willingness to trust data over tradition, to endure ridicule from people you respect because you believe you're right, to be first when being first means being alone. Merle Gustafson didn't invent soybean farming. He didn't discover anything the university agronomists hadn't already published. He just had the guts to apply it when nobody else would. And critically, he didn't do it to prove anyone wrong. He did it because the math made sense, because the agronomy was sound, because rotating crops was how you were supposed to farm if you cared about the land long term. The fact that he turned out to be spectacularly right, that soybeans became a major cash crop, that the market exploded in the '70s, that half the county ended up copying him, all of that was secondary. Merle would have done it even if prices had stayed flat, because it was the right way to farm. That's the lesson here. Not that you should chase trends or gamble on markets, but that you should trust good data even when it's unpopular. That you should be willing to be the first one to try something if the fundamentals are sound, and that you should do it quietly, without fanfare, knowing that if you're right, the neighbors will figure it out eventually. According to Illinois Department of Agriculture records, soybean acreage in the state went from just over 3 million acres in 1968 to more than 8 million acres by 1980. The shift transformed the agricultural economy of the state, made Illinois one of the top soybean producers in the nation, created entire industries around processing, transportation, and export. And it started with individual farmers making individual decisions, often in the face of skepticism and doubt. Merle Gustafson farmed until 1987, when he retired and turned the operation over to his oldest son, who'd studied agricultural economics at the University of Illinois and come back to farm. The son kept the rotation, corn and beans, beans and corn, and expanded to 600 acres. Today, Merle's grandson farms 1,200 acres in Livingston County, still rotating, still following the principles Merle applied back in 1968. Merle passed away in 2003 at the age of 77. His obituary in the Pontiac Daily Leader mentioned that he'd been a pioneer in soybean production in the county, one of the first to plant significant acreage back when it was considered experimental. But Merle never thought of himself that way. He thought of himself as a farmer who read the research and trusted the data. That's all. Nothing fancy, nothing heroic. Just a man who did the work and let the results speak for themselves. If you want more stories about the people who saw what was coming before everyone else, who had the courage to act on evidence instead of comfort, subscribe. These are the decisions that changed American agriculture, one stubborn farmer at a time. And if this reminds you of someone in your family, a father or grandfather who made a call everyone questioned but turned out to be right, leave their name in the comments. These stories matter. They're proof that individual conviction, backed by data and executed with discipline, can shift entire industries. One field at a time.